Good evening, everyone. My name is Ware Harmon, and I'm the Executive Director of Town Hall Seattle. On behalf of the rest of the staff here and our friends at Third Place Books, it's a pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual presentation of Lee McIntyre, part of our Arno Matulski Science Lecture Series. As we get underway, I want to acknowledge that our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, and particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're very, very glad you're back with us as we start another season at Town Hall. It's our 22nd. This will be a year like no year before it, with in-person events, virtual events, and something we're calling hybrid events that you can probably figure out what we mean by that. We're scaling up our podcast In the Moment, featuring exclusive interviews of authors, artists, and newsmakers by Jenny Palmer, Steve Scher, and other local correspondents. And many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. So in sum, there are just too many ways you can stay in touch with Town Hall this year. Tonight's program will run 50 to 60 minutes, including Q&A. To integrate our in-person and virtual audience experiences in this kind of strange tweener time, we've changed the Q&A platform for our events. To submit your question, please enter meet.ps/McIntire or scan the QR code on the screen right now, I hope, with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks again in the audience when we get to Q&A where you can go. And you can begin to actually post those questions throughout the talk, so we're ready to sort of go right into Q&A as Lee finishes up. We can't guarantee we'll get to every question, that said, but we will try to get to as many as possible. And you can do your part by keeping your question concise. For those who want to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include a look at quarantines in the past and in the very, very present, with authors Nicola Twilley and Jeff Maynaw. We'll be looking at the long and risky history of medical innovation with Paul Offit. And we'll feature the return of Town Hall favorite Thor Hansen, discussing how creatures big and small are trying to adapt to climate change. You can check our website or subscribe to our e-newsletter to get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible, as always, through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arno Matulski Science Lecture Series is supported by Microsoft and the Wyncote Foundation Northwest. But as you must know by now, Town Hall is above all a member-supported organization, and I want to thank all of our members watching tonight. If you share our vision of a healthy community strengthened by ideas and artistic expression, please consider supporting us tonight by making a donation or becoming a member. Last, you're here because you want to know more about the ominous growth of science denial in this civic and cultural moment. And the best way to go deeper still into tonight's topic is to purchase a copy of Lee McIntyre's book. So please use the link in the chat below to pick up your copy tonight through Third Place Books, rather than at some future time through some other vendor. And with that, Lee McIntyre is a research fellow at the Center for Philosophy and History of Science at Boston University, an instructor in ethics at Harvard Extension. A philosopher by training, he has taught philosophy at Colgate, Boston University, Tufts, and other Northeastern bastions of liberal education preferred by the coastal elites. It was probably a misguided attempt at sarcasm, you'll tell me later. Formerly executive director of the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University, he has also served as a policy advisor to the executive dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Harvard, and as associate editor in the research department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. Lee is also the author of at least a dozen books, including 2006's Dark Ages, The Case for a Science of Human Behavior, 2018's Post-Truth, Philosophy of Science from 2019, and later that year, The Scientific Attitude, which was the occasion of his last visit to Town Hall. His latest book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, Conversations with Flat Earthers, Climate Deniers, and Others Who Defy Reason, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Lee McIntyre.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation. I appreciate being back on Town Hall Seattle. Thanks. So last time I was at Town Hall Seattle, I was there in person and I had a sense of my audience. I don't know how many of you there are out there, but welcome. I'm glad you're here. I want to talk to you tonight about how to defend science from science deniers by giving scientists and science communicators and allies of science some tips and tools about how to push back. Now, you might be wondering, what could be better to push back against science deniers than the evidence? But here's the problem. You don't convince somebody who doesn't hold their beliefs based on evidence by presenting them with more evidence. That just doesn't work. That's called the information deficit model, where you're treating science deniers as if they were just your scientific colleagues, and once they know what the facts are, they'll believe it. But that doesn't quite work for reasons that we're going to explore. So what we really need is a little bit more strategic approach, which is what my book is about. And it's based on some research that I read about how to do this. Threshold question. Some people are worried about something called the backfire effect. So there was a study in 2010 that you might be aware of by Brendan Nine and Jason Riefler, where they did some experiments with partisans where they presented them with false information, and then they presented them with correcting information. And what they found is that people tended not to change their mind, which is perhaps not surprising. What they also found in that same study was that some hyperpartisans not only wouldn't change their mind, but that they doubled the occasion of having their beliefs corrected, caused them to hold their original beliefs even more strongly, which is a very perverse effect if you think about it. I mean, because not only didn't the truth disconfirm their beliefs, it confirmed their beliefs. Well, this was a really weird finding, and it led to a kind of a media freakout. There were articles in the Atlantic and the New Yorker about whether it raised the question of whether we were actually doing harm and trying to talk people out of their science denier beliefs. Well, the good news for us, for everybody, is that the second part of that, the backfire effect, the part where people double down, was a will of the wisp. It could not be recreated. It could not be reproduced in further studies. Nine and Riefler accepted this result. They're good scientists. They're honest people, and went ahead. Their original finding stands that it's very hard to get people to give up their beliefs. And again, we're going to talk about that. But what this showed is that you're not doing damage. Okay, so you don't have to worry that in talking to a science denier, you're going to somehow cause them to double down on their beliefs, because that apparently doesn't happen. As one commentator in this debate put it, we're fact resistant, but we're not fact immune. Okay, so in the summer of 2019, there was a landmark study. I joke with my friends that I could have read this study if my hair were on fire, because it was by Cornelia Batch and Philip Schmid, and it was in Nature Human Behavior. And it presented the first empirical evidence to show that, a statistically significant result that we could have an impact on science deniers. Let me describe the study just briefly. It was an online study of about 1,700 subjects in the USA and Germany. And what they did is they exposed them to a science denier message, and then they immediately corrected it, just kind of like the earlier study, the Backfire study. What they were trying to do was to debunk the misinformation that the person had heard. But there were two different ways that they tried to do it. First, no surprise, was what they called content rebuttal. Content rebuttal is when you say are an expert on content. Maybe you're a scientist, and maybe the subject is climate change, and you happen to be a climatologist. So that was effective. And I have to say, it was effective sometimes, not every time, but the point is often enough that it was a statistically significant result. But they found something else that was really fascinating to me, which is that the second way that you can push back against science deniers was something called technique rebuttal. And you don't have to be an expert in scientific content to do this. Because what happens is, as it turns out, all science deniers follow the same blueprint in flawed reasoning. This is based on some earlier work by the Hufnagel brothers and John Cook and Stephen Lewandowski. And it goes like this. There are 5 tropes of flawed reasoning that every science denier, flat earther, evolution denier, COVID denier, climate denier, they all follow this same strategy. First, they cherry pick evidence. Second, they believe in conspiracy theories. Third, they rely on fake experts and discredit real experts. Fourth, they engage in illogical reasoning. And fifth, they insist that science has to be perfect. That's really my favorite, because science deniers will often ask for proof. They want certainty. And anybody who really understands science understands that it's based on warrant. It's not Euclidean geometry. It's not deductive logic. Bache and Schmid found that both forms of rebuttal, content rebuttal and technique rebuttal, worked equally well, and that there was no additive effect. And that's huge, because what that means is you don't have to sit at home and say, I'm not a scientist, I shouldn't be out there. You can get out there, because once you've learned the 5 tropes of science denial reasoning, and you've studied a little bit, and you've studied some of the scripts in the Bache and Schmid article, you can go out there and do that. You can defend science, not by talking about the evidence, say, for why it's important to mask, or why COVID is real, or why climate change is real, but to talk about cherry picking evidence and believing in conspiracy theories and inconsistencies, illogic in what the deniers are saying. The bad news is that there's still, this doesn't work for everyone, and that there is still some negative effect to exposure to scientific misinformation. Bache and Schmid joke that if you're invited to a debate with a science denier, accept, but then cancel if it means you're going to cancel the debate, because then the misinformation won't get out there. But, it's a joke, because if the debate's happening, the worst thing is not to be there and to have the other person speaking, because once a liar has a microphone, the misinformation will get out there. And given the cognitive bias that we all suffer from, some people will believe disinformation and misinformation. All right. So I'm a philosopher of science. And as I said, I was really motivated by this study, and I loved this study. It's a brilliant study, but it's got some limitations. I had been studying science denial for years before this study came out. I was doing technique rebuttal before it was named technique rebuttal. A little bit of confirmation bias on my part, maybe, when I found out why I was so excited. But what I did is I identified 2 limitations in the study. I don't think there are flaws in the study. It's not, I'm not saying that. It was methodologically a very good study. It's just that a couple of questions came to me, and here they are. First, what I wanted to know was, it seemed to me that most of the people that they were dealing with in the study were people who were what I term the audience for science denial. These were folks who were hearing misinformation for the first time. So if somebody tells you false information and then they immediately take it back by saying, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, don't you know the problem with those? Then, it's not quite embedded. But what do you do about the hardcore deniers? Could these techniques, technique rebuttal and content rebuttal, work on people who had been marinating in scientific disinformation for years? And face it, there are an awful lot of people out there who are like that. So that was one question that I had. The second question that I had was, would this work, and would it maybe even work better in person than online? We all know from the comment section on a Washington Post article or from Twitter, that's the worst possible way to convince somebody online. Face-to-face, it seems to be much more persuasive. And so I started to wonder whether these techniques might work in person across a Thanksgiving table, elsewhere. And so I think that there are, and here's where I landed, there are answers to both of those questions, but they, as far as I know so far, they have not been studied scientifically. So I cannot give you empirical evidence to show. There is actually one recent study I can talk about in the Q&A if you like, the advantage of face-to-face over online persuasion, and this question about how to deal with hardcore deniers. So what I want to talk about next is some of the anecdotal literature. And that may seem like a bad thing to do because we're defending science, but what I'm doing here is identifying a pattern in the anecdotal literature that's something that surely could be studied by scientists. And I, in fact, had a conversation once with Cornelia Batch and asked, is she interested in this? And she potentially is. So what does the anecdotal literature tell us? It tells us that every single time a hardcore science denier changes his or her mind, they do it in the same way, the same pattern, over and over and over again. It's the same story. And they do change their mind, by the way. It's always on the basis of engagement with someone that they trust, someone that they have a relationship with. It's not that somebody shoves facts down their throat or tells them that they're stupid or insults them. It's that somebody takes the time to talk to them in an engaging way. So what it led me to is this idea that science denial is not just about doubt, it's about distrust. Because doubt can be overcome by evidence, but distrust really cannot. I mean, if you don't trust the person you're talking to, whatever they say by way of evidence, you're just not going to believe it. A magical thing happens when you engage with somebody as a human being and you talk to them respectfully, calmly, patiently. You listen to them. They begin to trust you. And that turns out to be the key in talking to science deniers. Now I'm trying to convince you that I'm right. So, and I'm not there to engage you in person, but one thing that I know is that arguments sometimes don't work, but stories work. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories. So you're in Seattle, well, you're around the world maybe, but pretend we're in Seattle. A few hours to the south of you is Vancouver, Washington, just across the river, the Columbia River from my hometown, Portland, Oregon. And they had a big measles outbreak there a few years back because there are a lot of anti-vaxxers in Vancouver and in Portland. And Jay Inslee, your governor in Washington State, no science denier. I mean, he ran for president on a climate change platform. Good for him. He sent public health officials down to Vancouver to talk with the anti-vaxxers face to face, and it worked. They didn't convince everyone, but there was an article about this in the Washington Post that you can read. It's called something like "It Will Take Off Like Wildfire." And there are fascinating quotes in here from people who were engaged by these public health officials. One woman said, this guy, he took out his whiteboard and he explained cell interaction for 2 hours, and he was warm and he was engaging, and, I trusted him. And now I'm going to get the vaccine, or vaccine for kids. I forget what it was, but the point was that engagement worked. Now I'll tell you a better story. This one's about climate change. A few years back, there was a member of Congress named Jim Bridenstine. He's a member of the House, and he gave a speech on the floor of the US House in which he said all the things that climate deniers say. And so, of course, Donald Trump appointed him as head of NASA, because what else would you do with a climate denier, right? Well, a funny thing happened to Jim Bridenstine when he got over to NASA and became the head of it. Within a couple of months, he changed his mind on climate change. Now, why? They asked him, and he said, well, he read a lot. Presumably, he had read a lot before. What happened, I think, is that all of these people that he distrusted, these scientists, these nameless, faceless scientists that he could dismiss as, sort of evil, lying people, he got to know them as human beings. He hung out with them in the halls. He had lunch with them. He was their boss. He began to trust them. And once he began to trust them, the data that they were churning out started to make sense to him. My point is this: even empirical beliefs can be tribal. Even empirical beliefs can be the kind of thing where, if you're on this team, you'll believe it. If you're on that team, you won't believe it. More than just facts and evidence are at stake for empirical beliefs. Your beliefs are often shaped by issues of trust and identity and values. What community are you in? What do the other people in your community believe? Now, that presents a bit of a problem if you're trying to convince somebody to give up their beliefs, because as you might imagine, if their beliefs aren't based on evidence, as I said at the beginning, how do you talk them out of it with evidence? And I mean, worse, if their beliefs are based on their identity, aren't you really having to change their identity? Jonathan Swift said it best: you can't reason someone out of something that they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. But Bache and Schmid showed that you can sometimes talk people out. Well, how does this happen? As I said, it depends on your approach. There is some research to back up the following ideas. Don't insult people. Don't yell. Appeal to scientific consensus. Graphs are more persuasive than text, than arguments. Stay calm. Some of this research was done by Nine and Riefler, the guys from the Backfire Effect study. The overall point is to listen. If you listen to a science denier, they will often tell you, without perhaps realizing it, the information that you need in order to convince them to give up their beliefs. Doesn't mean it's going to happen, and it might not happen right away, but a magical thing happens too. When you listen to somebody, they begin to trust you, and then they listen to you. You can change minds if you take the other person seriously and you engage and you build a dialogue over time. Don't expect it to be a one-off. And now I want to tell you about my personal experiences. In doing the research for this book, How to Talk to a Science Denier, I wanted to start with the worst science deniers that I could think of. So I went to the Flat Earth International Conference in Denver, Colorado in November 2018. And I went more or less undercover. I mean, I didn't lie to anybody, but I bought a ticket and I got the lanyard around my neck and I was wearing my flannel shirt, and, you know, I fit in with everybody else. I wear flannel shirts regularly, but, you know, there I was. And I spent the first day with my mouth shut. But the second day, I came out as a philosopher of science who had some questions. Now, I wasn't going to talk to them about the evidence for or against flat Earth. And I made that strategic decision. This is before the Bateson-Schmidt study. This is before they identified it as technique rebuttal. But I already knew as a philosopher, and just from listening to them the first day, they knew all the evidence. They just didn't accept it. Anything I told them about Aristarchus or Galileo or Newton, they already knew that. But they had this big conspiracy theory about how we hadn't been to the moon and Newton was a liar. And, you know, there were all these other reasons why they weren't going to accept that evidence. So I wouldn't have convinced them with that. What I wanted to do, therefore, was talk to them about how they were reasoning on the basis of evidence. And here I caught a break, because although the fact was that about 70% of the flat earthers were evangelical Christians. By the way, that doesn't mean that most evangelical Christians are flat earthers, but most of the flat earthers were evangelical Christians. They said that their views were not based on faith. And so I could say to them, okay, so you said your views are not based on faith, right? And they go, yeah, that's right. It's based on evidence. I'll say, okay. And then they were all set to talk about the evidence. But instead, I asked an important question from Karl Popper, the famous philosopher of science. I said, okay, so if your view is based on evidence, then tell me, what evidence, if I had it in my back pocket right now, would convince you that you were wrong? That's a very important question to ask, because if somebody cannot answer that question, it means that they're really not engaging with the subject in a scientific way. Any scientist can tell you what evidence would change their mind. I wrote a book about this called The Scientific Attitude. Science is based on the idea that evidence matters and that you change your mind when you get better evidence. So if a science denier can't do that, that means in some sense they have to own the idea, you know, if you can convince them that they're not really being scientific. They couldn't answer that question. And sometimes people would say, well, I just need proof, you know, which reveals to me, well, step 5, they don't understand how science works. And I would talk to them for a little bit about probability and certainty and, you know, why this was impossible in an inductive subject matter. You know, so some of them I didn't have productive conversations about that, but some of them I did. Some of the people really were troubled by the fact that they could not answer my question. Now, I wanted to do this. I wanted to take them seriously because my theory was that so if Cook and Lewandowski are right about these 5 tropes, then all science denial is the same. And if I could learn how to talk to them, if I could learn how to get the flat earthers to listen to me, then maybe I could go out and talk to climate deniers and get them to listen to me as well. And I was also aware that even if I didn't convince my conversation partner, there was an audience. I mean, there were 650 flat earthers and me. So when I started to talk to somebody, you know, they would crowd around and they would listen. So I wanted, you know, I was taking a shot at the hardcore. I would grab people when they came off stage after giving a presentation. And by ricochet, I wanted to have some influence on the audience. Remember the idea about the debate? If the disinformation is shared, you have to be there. And I wanted to be there. My best conversation was with a guy who had just gotten off stage, who gave a seminar on how to recruit people into flat Earth. And wouldn't you know, some of the tactics that he recommended were the exact same tactics that I was trying to use on them. So I invited him out to dinner, and we had a 2-hour dinner, my treat, just the two of us, no recording, no nothing, just going at it. And he was a very intelligent guy. And I started with my toughest question because I didn't want him to get, angry and leave. I didn't know how it was going to go. I mean, this was high stakes. So I asked him, what would it take to convince you? What evidence, if I had it in my back pocket, would convince you? And you could see by the look on his face that this really bothered him. And he talked for a while about going up in a rocket, but then he said, no, maybe the windows would be curved. And, we couldn't trust that. And then I remembered from one of the seminars that they had said that the flat earthers did not believe that Antarctica was a continent. They thought that Antarctica was a mountain range spread out around the perimeter of the Earth to keep the water from falling off. We wouldn't drop off the edge. That meant that Antarctica is 24,000 or so miles across rather than 1,000 or 1,500 or whatever it actually is. And so I suggested to him that we fly over it in a plane. And he said, those flights don't exist. And in my back pocket, I had the manifest for a flight that did exist from Santiago, Chile to Auckland, New Zealand. And he said, have you been on that flight? And I said, no, have you? Do you want to go? And he said, yes. We shook hands. And I thought, okay, great. And then I got to worrying about a little bit that he was going to say, well, the window was curved. When we got back, the ticket was $800 a piece, and I was going to crowdfund through my friends and, do this. But I thought, okay, we got to have a criteria. And I suggested to him that perhaps our criteria should be that if we had to stop to refuel, then he was, then that meant that it was, longer, but that if I was right, we wouldn't have to stop to refuel. And he shook hands on it. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to crowdfund, I'll do this. 2 minutes later, he took it back. And I asked him why. And he said, maybe having to stop for fuel was a hoax. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe any plane could go anywhere on Earth without refueling. And I said, well, then why do planes refuel? And he said, to fool us. And I said, so you're telling me that the entire history of air travel before you and I were even born was a hoax against the day when you and I would be sitting here tonight and I would be trying to convince you? And he said, yes. Now, at that point, you could say, conversation over, walk away. But I didn't. We stayed, we continued to talk. It was kind of clear to me at that point that it was going to, be difficult to change his mind. I mean, of course. But I had gotten him to listen to me and to take me seriously as I listened to him and took his point of view seriously, even though I didn't agree with his view and he didn't agree with mine. If I had been smart, I would have taken his email address and followed up with him. That's what I should have done. I didn't. I made a mistake that first time, treating it like a one-off. And in any case, I think that it's, at least I showed up. At least I brought down some of the walls of distrust. And the reason I wrote this book and the reason I'm talking about it is because I'm trying to convince more people to engage in either content rebuttal if you can, or technique rebuttal if that's what you want to do, and to join me out there talking to science deniers. Because I think that although it's sometimes an uncomfortable conversation and it doesn't always work, I think that there's empirical evidence to now show that it can. And here's my challenge. You don't want to be a science denier. The Bache and Schmid study has shown that this can be effective. So why aren't you out there doing it? If you're an ally of science, there is room for you to do this. You don't have to go to a flat earth convention like I did, but talk to your Uncle Jerry about vaccines over the Thanksgiving table. Talk to the people with whom you already have a relationship, who already trust and love you. That you'll have a head start, right? I went to Flat Earth. Nobody trusted me. Nobody loved me, right? It was a weird experience to have everybody in the room think that I was wrong. But if you start with people who already trust you and you keep your calm and you're respectful, I think that you'll have a good chance. I have some more things that I would perhaps say about disinformation and such, but what I'm going to do is just cut a little bit of it and just say this. Some of the reaction that people have against my proposal is not that they can't, but that they don't want to. They just, why should, they're angry at science deniers. And I understand that. COVID deniers right now are killing us. And, how can we talk to them, especially face to face, right? How can we do this? And my point is, if we don't, this problem is going to continue to get worse. I think that science denial is the basis for post-truth, for the political subordination of reality. 60 years of unchecked science denial is what led to the Stop the Steal campaign. It's what led to the insurrection on the US Capitol. We now have reality denial, not just science denial. And if we don't get ahead of this problem and see what we can do about it, it's gonna continue to get worse. Think of it this way, if it helps to think about why you should go out and talk to science deniers. Most of them are victims. They did not come up with the bad information that they have. They read it somewhere, they heard it somewhere, they saw it on social media. A science denial is not a mistake, it's a lie. It's an intentionally created lie by people who profit from disinformation. We can talk a little bit in the Q&A if people have questions about, why that would be the case. There's a longer story here about the tobacco companies profiting from denial over whether cigarette smoking causes cancer, the fossil fuel companies profiting over climate denial. We all understand that kind of profiting. But there are foreign governments that profit from the polarization that's going on in Western democracies right now, from having us at each other's throat over basic factual questions. And this is something that I say a little bit about in the book. I'll close with this. There are really three problems at issue with science denial. There's the creation of disinformation, there's the amplification of disinformation, and there's the uptake of disinformation. My book is really aimed at the third category. It's what you do when it's too late, right? When the disinformation is already out there and people are believing it. Even then, right, even if the virus has already spread of disinformation out to the community, there are still things that you can do. I'm thinking more and more these days about what else we can do, how to stop the amplification. There's a terrific series this week in the Wall Street Journal on Facebook and what they know and what they don't know about what their platform is doing. In March and April, there were major media stories that nobody's talking about anymore about how the Russian government owns and controls media outlets that are pumping out vaccine disinformation that then gets picked up by partisan media, by social media. Sometimes they just go directly to Facebook or Twitter. An amazingly small number of people can do a horrible amount of damage. There was a study reported by NPR recently that found that 65% of the anti-vax propaganda on Twitter was created by 12 people. I call them the disinformation dozen. On Facebook, it was 111 profiles responsible for 50% of the propagandistic content about vaccines. Meanwhile, a lot of our fellow citizens are going down the rabbit hole. They're believing this stuff. And there's something that we can do about it. We can reach them. We can talk to them. We also need to put pressure on our government to do more about regulating social media, if that's something that you think is a good idea, about pushing back, recognizing that we're in an information war with Russia and how they might push back against that. But what can we as individual citizens do? We can get out there and talk to science deniers. That's it.
Lee, thank you so much for that. Hi, everyone. My name is Faith, and I'm the house manager here at Town Hall. And we are going to just have a conversation about everything that you said, and we're going to dive into the audience Q&A. And if you didn't get a chance to scan that QR code, you may do that now and take your time to send them in, because we have a lot to discuss here. Lee, hello. Thank you for that. That was very informative, and it felt very targeted at not myself. Well, yes, myself, but also just kind of a big, broad stroke of our society today. I think this is very relevant, and there will always be science deniers, always.
There have been throughout history. It's worse today because of the internet.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say, I feel that when you said, you fight evidence with more evidence, that's not the right way to approach it. But then I thought, oh gosh, where do I get my evidence? You know what I mean? And I think a bunch of the people around me go to Facebook or go to social media, and we kind of just keep posting and posting, and like no one really listens to each other. And I'm definitely guilty of that.
We all are.
Yeah,
and we all have relatives who are anti-vaxxers or climate deniers that we can talk to. So before the Q&A starts, I just want to apologize to the audience that if you hear some commentary from my German shepherds here behind me, that sometimes happens. But I've got two sleeping German shepherds here behind me, so try to ignore it.
Oh, thank you so much. I think it would be nice to kind of dive into the core and the start of this. And one of the questions from the audience is, how did you start this journey? What inspired you most? So was there a specific event, or did you always want to go into this from childhood?
I've always been interested in science. I've always been interested in the question of what's distinctive about science, how scientists know things. It's just always seemed to me to be just such a great thing that science is one of those things where we keep from fooling ourselves. We say, I'd like to believe this, but I'm going to gather some evidence and see if I'm wrong. That just seems to me like it's just a terrific thing. And then in the middle of writing a book, The Dark Ages, about how to extend science to the social sciences, all of a sudden, natural science started to be attacked. And I thought, well, I better defend natural science. How long could this take? But then people kept draining more and more water out of the pool. I mean, over the last 20 years, it's just been horrifying to watch as first natural science, then, kind of all science, and then now reality itself seems to be in question. I remember as a kid reading the encyclopedia, reading about the famous scientists and philosophers and thinking, oh, man, in Galileo's time, it would have been easy to stand up for truth and reason because look at all the people attacking it. Nobody does that now. Well, here we are.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Do you think that with people, where should people go for their evidence? Obviously not social media. I mean, do you think it would be easy to kind of pull up a theory, pull up Galileo, pull up something that is factual and within an encyclopedia? Do you think that's easy to do?
It's really important to vet your sources.
Yeah.
If you're going to a good source, then you don't have to be worried each and every time you read a fact. Is that true? Is that true? Is that true? Look, sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes science gets it wrong. But the point is, there are more reliable sources. For me, the telltale thing is when I start to feel like, yeah, that's got to be true because I want it to be true. That's when the inner philosopher tells me, calm down a minute, make sure. And then if you dig a little, you can usually find out. There's some rubrics that were shared during the Trump administration about how to tell fake news from real news. And sometimes the lies are just tissue thin. And if you just push a little bit, you'll find out, oh, I see, that person's got a website where they're selling this product that's a competitor to the product that they just were slagging against,
Yeah.
Or, I see who's paying their bills, So, if you just push it a little bit, you can find the reliable sources.
Okay. So, I mean, it's not hard to do. obviously.
It takes a little time.
Yeah.
And it's, I mean, we're all responsible at that level. I mean, look, I read things that I get on Facebook as well, but I don't just click on it and I don't just share it without clicking on it. I click on it, I read it. If it refers to a study, I read the study.
Yeah.
It just happened to me today. I was reading a major media account of something, and then I thought, is that true? And I clicked on the study. No, not quite. They had run two things together that weren't quite the case. So
Yeah.
you have to be critical.
Do you think that when people post, the big headliner and then you read into it, do you think a lot of people don't read into it and they just kind of get their audience with the subject and
Of course.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been shown. I think a shock, I don't know what the figure is, but a shocking percentage of people share share stories without even having read the story. And think of all that fake news clickbait that's out there just to get you to do that, during the election. It's very Orwellian, how people create, I mean, with the most cynical purposes possible, to disinformation campaign. Yeah.
This is something I'm very curious about from the audience. This is the question: Do you find that people who are disagreeing is generation versus generation, left and right, or something else entirely?
Yeah, it's a great question. Science denial comes from everywhere.
Sure.
You wouldn't think, and I mean, it's because at least part of it is based on our cognitive bias, and we all have cognitive bias. If you start thinking that science denial is somebody else's problem, then that's a problem for you, right? Because then that means that you're not going to see coming the thing that you really, really hope is true, and you're maybe even denying it yourself. So you have to be vigilant about that. I mean, there are probably some demographic issues, depending on the topic. There's some generalizations you can make about all science denial, but sometimes if you look at evolution versus climate change versus GMOs, the pushback is by different people. For me, one of the most interesting was the political one that you just raised, and in the book I explore whether there's a good example of left-wing science denial.
Yeah.
There I'm going to leave that hang and let people buy the book and find out. But I mean, the question is, if we're immune to it, why is there any denial from the left?
Sure.
But a shocking number of anti-vaxxers or people who deny the truth about GMOs are from the left. So it can exist no matter what your politics.
Sure. I personally want to bring up the 2-hour dinner from the Flat Earth Conference in Colorado, correct? Was that Colorado?
Colorado.
Yeah, I thought I put myself in your shoes. Obviously, I'm not, any type of philosopher by any means, but I want to know how you felt going into that, and if you felt safe. And I mean, you wouldn't have gone if you thought you were going to put yourself in danger, but just tell me more of how you felt kind of going into that space.
I never felt unsafe.
Okay.
I mean, it was disorienting to be around people who didn't believe what I believed, but I never felt unsafe, especially not one-to-one. There was one. I'll say this. This is a funny story.
Okay.
I don't tell this story very often, but there was one moment when I had just gotten there, and the very first speaker, there was some media there in the back, from local media, and they said, don't just sit there and look at us and report on us as if we were, freaks. Stay here at the conference, learn what we think. Don't just do your hit and run reporting and leave in 15 minutes. And then, of course, what happened? Most of the media left in 15 minutes.
Right.
And then, so they got to the second presentation, and the guy got up on stage and he said, "Close the doors. It's just us now." And I thought, what's about to happen?
Right.
That seemed really weird to me.
Sure.
But it was nothing different than what had happened. It was just that people were very enthusiastic. I mean, it was they greeted one another as friends. They were enthusiastic, they were joyful. People were standing up shouting, in happiness to be surrounded by people who believed what they believed. I think that all science denial is based on identity, and they're looking for community, and they found it in their personal lives. Flat earthers are alienated from other members of their church, from their family. Sometimes they lose their jobs. It was a big deal for them to be there. And I was not there to take anything away from them. I was not there to threaten them. I was a pretty calm guy. And I think at one point, maybe they thought they could convince me, but, because why was I there? But it was a weird experience, but I didn't feel unsafe.
That's good. My question now is, when you were there, and were you the only science denier there? Did you know?
Science denier? Well, they don't.
Were you the only believer of science? Is what I mean. Sorry about that.
Well, here's the thing. They don't think of themselves as science deniers. They think of themselves as scientific. They'll call themselves skeptics, and in fact claim that I was the denier. So nobody ever self-identifies that way. But here was the interesting thing that I noted. They believed in science. They'd flown there on planes. They were using Twitter on their phones. That, by the way, has satellite traffic, right, on that phone. But I mean, they were spreading their opinions about flat Earth on phones. They were using technology. They believed in science. This is typically, I think of science deniers as cafeteria skeptics. Everything's okay except this, and this, right? They'll pick out the things that they don't like. They'll trust the science. Think about it with COVID. They don't trust the people who made the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine. But when they get COVID, they go to the hospital. Oh, doc, give me everything you've got, right? Trust the very same people that maybe they didn't trust in other circumstances. So it's very selective.
Yeah.
Look, maybe there were other people there who were undercover, but how are we going to find one another?
Sure.
I mean, I did find out later that there were maybe a few others just from reading media accounts, but for all any of us knew, we were alone.
Yeah. Bringing up COVID, there is a question about that. What are science deniers afraid of, such as the vaccine? If millions of people are getting it, what are they protecting themselves from?
It's a good question. I think that that's a question that you could ask somebody who didn't want to get the vaccine. Remember that science denial exists on a spectrum. Some people really are vaccine hesitant. It's not just a euphemism, there's some people that I would not use the word denier. They're hesitant because they've been confused. They've heard all this information. They don't know who to trust. And so asking them a question like that might be interesting, right? To say, 170 million Americans have gotten this vaccine. Don't you think we would have heard by now?
Right.
A lot of them were dying. And I mean, some people have claimed that they are, but they have not. I mean, some people will try to direct your attention to, false statistics, but that's part of the challenging the logic, right? That's part of technique rebuttal, to say, isn't that inconsistent? That you're not following what everybody else is doing. We would have known by now. The other thing you could talk to them about is relative risk. I mean, even if there are risks, long term that none of us know about, you face an immediate risk of death now. And so balance those two against one another. So I think that's a great question, and could be the beginning of a conversation with somebody if you ask it in the right way.
There was a news article that I read. I was with my friends, and it had said, the vaccinated are doing much better than the unvaccinated, and I thought, yes, of course. And I just didn't really know what that was saying or what that was doing, because I thought, if, someone who was unvaccinated read that, would that then go, oh, now I should be vaccinated. You know what I mean? I thought, what is that? How is that kind of bringing them in? I didn't really know what the point of that was.
Um,
Because to me, it felt obvious, but then I thought, for the people who aren't getting the vaccine,
well,
are they now
remember,
convinced?
but remember, are they making the decision based on evidence? Or are they basing
Mm,
it on identity, right? If you're surrounded every day by other people who are not getting the vaccine,
right.
it might seem like a betrayal to get it. And in fact, some people, there's media accounts now of people going in disguise to the next town over to get their COVID vaccine because they don't want their friends and neighbors to see that they're getting the vaccine.
Right, yeah, yeah. This kind of shows, I don't know if this question's from Seattle, but it says, I live in a blue bubble. Don't actually know any vaccine deniers. What should I do?
I'll bet you do know some.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll bet I mean, they're not everybody's in your face about it. Um, I don't know. I mean, sometimes you have to go to where they are.
Mm,
I, found the mother lode when I went to Denver of
yeah.
flat earthers. There are anti-vax conventions. They don't call it that. There are anti um, climate change conventions. There's one coming up in Las Vegas in a
Mm,
few months. I mean, now that's hardcore. You go into
yeah.
something like that, you've got to know what you're walking into. But if you seek out these kind of conversations, there are people you can have them with. There, I was just reading today about a group on Facebook. I forget what it's called, but it was a group that was put together of evidence-based for evidence-based conversations, and it's heavily moderated and they kick people out if they're insulting. But I mean, there are places online to have these conversations too.
Mm,
And but it's a good question. If you're motivated to do this, how do you find people? I'm curious to know what the blue bubble is. I mean, I live in Boston. That's about as blue bubble-ish as it gets.
yeah.
I know people who are anti-vaxxers.
Hmm.
I people that I could have these conversations with.
Hmm. I find that you are a calm guy, as you've said many times before. You seem very put together, very, very with it. Do you feel that you've ever had a tipping point?
Oh, sure.
Sure, yeah. How do you keep that down?
Um, well, I don't always. I just try not to do it out in front of in front of people.
Sure,
I
sure.
mean, look, I don't have young children. My children are all grown.
Mhm.
If I had young children, this would be a much more emotional thing for me, I think. I mean, I have friends who have young children and say, I was, school is in person now, and should I send my son to school in person the first day? Well, there was a COVID case on the first day,
Mhm.
in kindergarten.
Yeah,
I mean, Biden said the other day he's losing patience. I think a lot of people have already lost their patience, and
yeah.
it's okay to lose your patience.
Mhm.
Just don't expect that if you do it in front of somebody you're trying to convince that it's going to make any difference to them.
Right.
Um, it's not going to help. It might make you feel better, but actually, I bet it won't.
Mhm.
Um, my model in this, the people that I get inspiration from, are the folks out there doing much harder things than what I'm doing.
Mm.
I've got some friends. They became friends. People that I interviewed for my book. Dave and Aaron Neinhauser run a group called Hear Yourself Think. They're up in the coal country corner of Pennsylvania, and they go to Trump rallies and they film
Oh,
it
wow.
and they engage people in respectful dialogue, and then they teach classes on how to do this. They're super brave to do
Yeah.
that and effective. um, I've been reading about uh, uh, accounts of people who use these same sorts of techniques. I mean, I didn't invent these techniques. They're out there to
Mhm.
talk people out of cults, to talk people out of white supremacy,
Mhm.
to talk people out of all sorts of political extremist beliefs. So, I mean, there are people who are, doing much braver things where, they'd have to fight, they're losing patience. I mean, I'm not to say that being upset with COVID deniers isn't a big deal, because, as I say, in the middle of a pandemic, especially risk to our health, that's a hot button thing. but I mean, sure, yeah. Personally, I lose it. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you do. I mean,
not on camera.
not on camera, of course. Our next question is, what is the biggest backlash you've encountered, and what did you learn from that?
Oh boy, that's a good question. My volume of hate mail has increased exponentially over the last
Wow.
couple of years.
Hmm.
And I get a diversity of hate mail.
Mm,
I get it from, different topics, which I don't particularly want to talk about too much to
yeah.
identify because I'm not going to encourage more. But I'll say this: what I've learned is that sometimes people's opening salvo is hostility
Mm,
because they expect hostility in return. So, and face to face, you can diffuse that. But I've learned that you can diffuse that even by email.
mm,
That some people who contact me just kind of angry in that first encounter, I'll say, well, it sounds like you're really passionate about this issue. Tell me, more about, and we'll go back for. Sometimes I have dialogues back and forth with them, respectful, not always ultimately successful, not usually successful.
mhm.
It's not as good a format as one would hope for. But I've been surprised at the fact that if you treat somebody with if somebody opens with hostility and you treat them with respect, they'll immediately back off.
Yeah,
Sometimes they don't, but then they're not probably going to go back and forth several times either. They're just going to stop writing to me.
sure. Yeah, yeah. Our last question is, oh, there's a new question. Here's one of them. It's the problem I have encountered in trying to talk to an anti-vaxxer whom I care about is that she no longer watches TV news or reads newspapers. She gets her facts from alternative means. Each argument is met with a claim that there is a conspiracy in which the pharmaceuticals, medical profession, and media are complicit.
Yes. That is a problem, right? Because remember the trope three, a reliance on fake experts and denigration of real experts.
Mm,
If you can work it around in your mind that everybody at the New York Times, the Washington Post, all the scientists, all the government officials, all of those folks are lying to you.
mhm,
And the only people that you can trust are, the subversive, the alternative media, however you want to describe it.
mhm.
um, then you've got yourself in this hermetically sealed, information bubble where you're, as I said, it's not about doubt, it's about distrust. You're not trusting those other sources. You could, I mean, I suppose I saw a very interesting documentary one time called The Brainwashing of My Dad, which was
Mm,
about politics. There's my dog creeping around. Um, and it was not about science at all, it was about politics. And it was about this woman who felt that she had lost her dad
mm,
to Fox News, to right-wing talk radio.
mm.
And then one day his radio broke and he came back. And so I would say you probably won't be able to get your friend to stop what they're doing, but maybe you can talk to them more to try to change the balance of it.
Mm,
Or ask. Sometimes what I do with people who write to me, I'll say, send me your most convincing sources, and
mm,
then I'll look at it and I'll write back and I'll say, well, this person that you've cited as a reliable source on anti-vax, he's got a website where he's selling products that are natural cures that compete with vaccines, and he's worth $100 million.
mm.
Don't you think that guy maybe has a vested interest
Yeah,
in being anti-vax? Doesn't that make you suspicious? I mean, you're a conspiracy theorist. Couldn't you be a little suspicious about that?
sure,
So
yeah.
you can bring up things like that. So don't just look at it like a wall of disinformation. You can't touch it. Scratch it a little bit and see what comes out.
Hmm. I'm finding that with our whole conversation today, I think what I'm really going to try and take away is balance and um, not really fighting evidence with evidence. And they'll believe, the facts that they want to believe, but I find myself getting defensive, just as defensive as they are. But
Sure.
that's not the right thing to do if we
If
really
it,
want to, help each
facts
other.
facts can work if you bide your time, right?
Yeah.
If you're engaging and you listen. I remember my conversation with the flat earthers. I would just listen for the, however long they want to talk. And then, but eventually as a human being, people will say, don't you think I'm right? Or what do you think?
Yeah.
And then I'll say, well, I think you're relying pretty heavily on a conspiracy theory there. And for somebody who believes in evidence, I don't see a lot of evidence that your conspiracy theory is true.
Mm-hmm.
And then, they'll say, well, well, that just shows you how good the conspirators are. And I'll say, well, now look, so what are you doing there? You're counting both evidence in favor of the conspiracy theory and the lack of evidence for the conspiracy theory as both evidence that it's true. How is your view possibly subject to empirical refutation? It's not.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can have those kind of conversations with people and it will make them uncomfortable because you're talking about how they're reasoning. And a lot of the disinformation that that they've heard, that they're prepared to share with you, there's my other dog, it's kind of a script that they've learned from somebody else,
right?
But they're not talking about how they're reasoning about it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's okay, Gigi.
Gigi, it's okay. And on that note, Lee McIntyre, thank you so much for being here with us in Seattle tonight. This was wonderful and very informative for all of us.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it. The only thing better would be if I could have been in Seattle, but we did the best we could, and my dogs have woken up, so I have to go.
Yes, and remember everyone at home to buy a copy of the book from our partner bookseller, Third Place Books, and that link can be found in the chat. From all of us at Town Hall, thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much.